As more people start to use ChatGPT and other AI tools, our thoughts about what's fair and what to trust are evolving. The Pew Research Center is digging into this, and it offers some of the most comprehensive surveys of American public opinion. I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in 2 U.S. cities.
As the disk rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte I present to you Electro, the Moto Man.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, a look at how we're feeling about generative AI.
I'm Alec Tyson. I'm the Associate Director at Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center, we try our best to understand basically the trends and issues shaping the world. One of the tools we use, or my team uses in particular, is public opinion research. How do Americans feel about the issues in their world? And at the science team, that includes trying to understand artificial intelligence and how people are experiencing it.
All right, so you recently looked at American views on Gen AI, and you found some pretty interesting things, I think. Let's start with ChatGPT. What did your analysis find there?
Well, ChatGPT, of course, is one of the most visible forms of generative AI, and what we found is an uptick in the share of U.S. adults who say they've used it themselves. Almost a quarter of U.S. adults, 23%, say they've ever used ChatGPT, and that's up significantly from a year ago. It remains a fairly modest segment of the public. The opposite is that about 3/4 haven't used this. But at the same time, it's up, and it's up in particular among young people. Among young people, 43% say they've ever used ChatGPT. So we're seeing growing penetration of one of the most high-profile examples of generative AI.
Yeah, and I think you saw that people are using it more at work as well.
That's right. We ask a variety of ways in which you could potentially use this, and the share of U.S. adults who say they've used it at work, now this is among employed adults, people who are working, it's up to 20%, right? So about 1 in 5
Wow.
workers now say they've used ChatGPT at work.
What about citing its sources? This to me was super interesting, actually, with all the conversations we've had around anything from copyright to trust. What did you find about that?
Well, we wanted to explore this question of should generative AI programs credit their sources? And of course, on a technical level, this may be fairly complicated, but we wanted a public leaning. Should they be doing this, or is this not really necessary? And what we found in our survey is a consistent leaning towards the view that generative AI programs need to credit the sources that they use to basically inform or produce a response. 54% of Americans say that. Only 14% say the opposite, that they don't need to credit their sources. And then a pretty sizable share of Americans, 32%, say they're not sure. And that's an important facet of public opinion at this point. Not everyone has an opinion on these types of questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. But is that belief different depending on the type of content we're talking about, like art versus maybe an answer to a question?
That's exactly the question we wanted to explore. We asked a high-level question about this concept of credit in general, and then we followed up with a list of 7 specific items. And here's where it gets really interesting, right? Is the sentiment for consistent support. We see it whether we're talking about generative AI providing information that matches what a journalist wrote nearly word for word. 75% say credit is needed in that scenario. Only 6% say it's not, and then you have about 2 in 10 who say they're not sure. But what's really interesting is that desire or public sentiment supporting credit extends to much more general types of information. When it comes to an example we included in our survey, like summarizing information about the US population, here still we find 60% think generative AI programs need to credit the sources they use, even if they're rendering this more general type of information. A couple of other dimensions we were interested in is recency, right? Is there a difference between, say, imitating the writing style of a current author versus imitating the writing style of a famous author who died many years ago? Much more similarity than difference we see here, consistent with this public sense for credit. About 2/3 say generative AI programs should credit their sources if they imitate the writing style of a current author. In almost the same percentage, it's only 2 percentage points difference, 67% versus 65%, say the same if they render content that imitates the writing style of an author who died many years ago. So that was an interesting dimension to explore. Is doesn't matter how recently active the creator was, at least in the examples we included in our survey, we saw consistent support for the idea of giving credit.
And how big was this sample? Can you tell us more about how the research was put together?
Sure. So these are nationally representative surveys of U.S. adults. The Pew Research Center does much of its opinion collection, or almost all of it, on our American Trends panel. We offer methodological details online, but it's a high quality, probability based, or a recruited sample, right? And that's what our surveys are based upon.
Were there other differences across the items that jump out to you?
Another thing that we saw is this idea of originality or the level of originality. Here we tested this by looking at an example of generative AI providing content that matches what a journalist wrote nearly word for word versus providing content that basically aligns with what many different news organizations have reported. Now, there's a big difference there, right? Between like original, maybe a scoop type reporting versus lots of folks can tell you that there's an eclipse coming up soon. But even here, we see pretty broad sentiment that the public thinks there should be credit given. Yes, there is some difference, 75% for the word for word or nearly word for word example, but still as high as 61% for the more general type of information that may have been reported by many different news organizations. The public just aligns with this idea that as best they can, these programs should be pointing out or crediting the sources they use to render this information.
Fascinating. And also, one would think helpful with these. We talk a lot about trust on this program, and with the lack of trust potentially in some of these tools, it would feel helpful to know where the tools are getting their information.
That's a theme we have seen in our previous research on artificial intelligence, is that while the answer may not always be simple from a technical point of view, this idea of transparency absolutely is a value that the public is looking for when they're engaging with artificial intelligence.
What about labor or with the recent Hollywood strike? Did you find anything around creative content for perhaps the film industry or other creative industries?
Great recent example, and we didn't include an example of that in our survey, is the item read if generative AI programs created content or drafted a script in the style of a popular movie, should they or should they not have to give credit? And here again, 61% say yes, they should have to give credit in this instance. And it is notable that we've had a pretty high profile labor agreement that includes significant provisions restricting the use of AI in creative work in the case of the Hollywood writers' strike. So a very current example, and that's what we found in our survey, and I think we're glad to have this item in here.
Did anything surprise you about this research?
One of the things that we found notable here was the level of consistency in this idea of generative AI offering credit to the sources they reviewed to provide their answers. We worked hard to come up with the list that varied across dimensions, that had some differences across the examples. And while there were some modest differences, by and large, the public response was clear that credit is what they're looking for across these examples.
Do you think people really understand how often they're interacting with AI?
Well, that's a good question, right? And so on the one hand, we ask a descriptive question, how often do you think you interact with AI? And this is of all US adults. We find about 22% feel they interact with AI at least several times a day. Another 27% say they interact with AI at least several times a week. And then half of Americans perceive that they interact with artificial intelligence less often, right? So part of what this underscores is that this is still an emerging issue for many Americans, but it's also a self-report. And the data do suggest that there may be a bit of a gap between the share or level of folks who are interacting with AI versus the share who perceive that interaction. That is to say that not everyone who interacts with AI is actively aware of that fact. And we know this from other research as well. We conducted, you could call it a short knowledge survey of awareness of AI in daily life. And only 3 in 10 Americans were able to correctly identify the presence of AI in 6 examples, 6 multiple choice questions about AI in everyday life. Things like AI working on a video doorbell, or maybe AI working to offer a customized shopping recommendation. So that suggests that not everyone who's interacting with AI necessarily is actively aware of it.
Was it different across different demographic groups?
Absolutely, right. And this is one of the consistent patterns that we see is that education matters. Adults with higher levels of education tend to score better on knowledge or awareness quizzes, and they're also more likely to say they interact with artificial intelligence. Now, part of that may reflect reality in that folks with higher levels of education or higher socioeconomic statuses may in fact be interacting with artificial intelligence more often because of the types of tools and products they work with. But it also reflects the fact, in part, that they are more aware of the technologies themselves.
How does all of this inform the work you're going to be doing next or what you'll be watching for in the months ahead?
Well, this particular report is just part of our broader efforts to understand how Americans are viewing AI. It's something we've been committed to for several years at the center, and we have great trends that predate really the generative AI boom of over a year ago now. And one theme we continue to follow is the overall level of caution or concern Americans express towards AI in their daily life. As AI has grown more visible, we've actually seen an uptick in the share of adults who express concern about AI in daily life. It's up to 52%. It was at 38% in early 2022. That's one really high level trend we want to continue is as AI becomes more prominent, are folks getting more excited in a way more comfortable with this tech? Or are they continuing to view it with caution or even concern?
So, do you know why that number is falling? Do you have particular insights into why we feel the way we do about this?
Well, it's certainly something we're working to understand. And one way we've gone about this, if we've asked an open-ended question. People can use their own words, right? And so if you say you're more concerned than excited about the growing prominence of AI, we ask you why. And part of what we've heard here is really powerful, right? Some of it centers around jobs and employment, like the loss or the potential loss of human jobs. That's absolutely one of the top responses we hear. Another one that's a bit different in nature is concerns generally about surveillance, digital privacy, an online or environment where AI is too involved or knows too much about us, perhaps. And then another theme we hear, which is quite different in nature, is about our human nature, right? A lack of human connection, a concern that technology will replace tasks that are best done by people for people, right? Something essential about who we are as people. We absolutely hear that as a theme when we talk about what makes people concerned about artificial intelligence.
Is there anything else we haven't gotten to yet?
Well, you can also think about the flip side of the coin, which is what makes people excited about artificial intelligence, right? And part of what we see here is a sense that it could make life better. Certainly, we hear things about it could save time or make things more efficient or help handle mundane or tedious tasks. And that's a big distinction we see in our data is there's much, much more comfort with artificial intelligence when it's acting to augment or assist humans in tasks than when it's given more control or more autonomy. That's where you start to see really heightened levels of concern. But as an assist or an augmentation or helping to deal with repetitive or mundane tasks, there's a lot of openness to AI.
This episode was produced by me and Emma Silikans and mixed by Garrett Lang, with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.
From PRX.